Hi there. Thanks for checking out this video on creating a Windows virtual machine in Azure. Now, about a year ago, I also created a video for YouTube on creating a virtual machine. The interface has changed, a few things have changed recently, and so it's time to do another video for 2019. This is how to create a virtual machine in Microsoft Azure. First of all, I'm going to assume that you do have a Microsoft Azure account. You have an Azure Portal account. Microsoft does have a pretty generous free plan. So if you go to azure.microsoft.com/free, you'll be able to sign up for a free account. A credit card is required, but you do get $200 worth of services in the first 30 days and 12 months of free services, including 2 virtual machines, 1 Linux and 1 Windows per month. Assuming you have that, you'll log into portal.azure.com and you click on the upper left corner. It says create a resource, takes you to this menu. Now the first item on this is the Windows Server 2016 virtual machine. You could certainly find other images, and we'll get to that. There's a drop down, but choosing the first one will just get you into the wizard. Now we'll see here the brand new interface for creating a virtual machine. Microsoft has been changing its interface throughout Azure for various things. So this is a brand new interface for creating a virtual machine. Right off the first page here, it's going to ask us for a subscription. Now our subscription is going to be different. Mine will be different than yours. You might have the free plan. You might have a corporate plan or an MSDN plan or something else. So mine's pay as you go. So everything that I do in Azure comes off my credit card. The next thing you have to decide is a resource group. Now, a resource group is very much like a folder structure. You can create resources and organize them into these resource groups. Makes it very easy for security. I particularly like it for cleanup. So after I'm going to create this virtual machine, I'm going to be able to delete all the resources that are associated with it. I'll click this link for create new and I'll give it a name. So new 2019 VM. Okay. This name can be anything as long as it's unique to your Azure subscription. So new resource group will be created. Now the virtual machine itself needs a name. I usually start my virtual machines with AZSJD because that's just going to keep it unique. But this only needs to be unique to this resource group, so you could call it anything you want. Now the region. There are a couple of implications when you're choosing region. As of the time of recording, there are over 50 regions of the world that you can create Azure virtual machines in. Right? So we switch over to the Microsoft website, we can sort of see a map of all of the regions that are coming, announced, or available. Now, some of these are just not going to be accessible to us because we don't have the right permissions. So all of the Department of Defense ones or the US government ones, of course, we're not going to have access to those. The ones in China, we would not have access to those as well. So ultimately, out of 54 regions, we might only have access to 30 to 40 of them. Let's go back to the portal, and we can see the list from this drop-down. Now, depending on where you create your virtual machine, it's going to impact some of your availability options. So for instance, if I choose Canada East, I would not be able to set this into a specific availability zone, and we'll talk about that in a second. Microsoft is slowly rolling this out to more regions. Right now, this availability zones are available in things like Central US. I think it's also available in East US and France and a few other places. So I'm going to create this in East US. Next up is the availability options. Now, by default, if you're just going to create a single virtual machine, then there's no purpose for you to put this into an availability zone or an availability set. This option is only for when you need to create multiple virtual machines. This is a way to increase the availability or the uptime of your application. By having your application installed in 2 or more virtual machines, this allows users to access your application. It usually goes through a load balancer. And if one of those machines goes down for whatever reason, it doesn't impact your users all that much. So putting your multiple VMs into the same availability set allows Microsoft to distribute those VMs into different hardware and different locations within their data centers so that they can, for planned or unplanned outages, you're only going to lose one virtual machine or as few virtual machines as possible when you have this particular outage. For an availability zone, it actually increases the availability of your application because you get to actually define in which data center within this region you can put your virtual machine. So for instance, for East US region, if I choose availability zone, I get 1, 2, and 3 options. So I can put one VM in availability zone 1 and a different VM in availability zone 2, etc. Since we're just creating a single virtual machine, we don't need to choose any availability options. Next up, we get to choose the image. Now remember I said that when you choose Windows Virtual Machine, you actually do get to choose again. So that wasn't a final decision until this point where now you choose the actual version. So you can see 2016 Data Center, 2012, 2008, and Windows 10 Pro. Now there are more images available. There's some Linux options here as well. You can say browse all images, and that will take you to the marketplace where you can find all of the available virtual machine images. I'm going to leave this as 2016 because I don't have any other reason to downgrade it to 2012 or 2008 or anything. Now, the next major decision you have to make is the virtual machine size. By default, Microsoft's going to set you up with this DS1 V2 virtual machine, which comes with one single virtual CPU and 3.5 gigabytes of memory. Now, for testing purposes, this is perfectly fine. I could just continue on. But let's look at the different options. When I say change size, I'm taken to this table that contains 197 options. So because I chose the East US region, I get 197 options for virtual machines. If I chose a different region, I would expect this number to be different. So for instance, in some farther region outside the United States, you might find only 100 options because they just don't have that many servers available. But in East US region, 197 options. Now, they do automatically filter based on the machine size, so it's only showing me a 0 to 4 CPUs, which is, the smallest. Now, if I want to see some larger machines, I can remove this filter. It's also now restricting it to current generation machines. So there are some older generation machines that maybe you have particular reasons to choose. That's another thing that's limiting this. The family of virtual machines, so we have general purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, storage optimized, high performance GPU. So this is just limiting it to the general purpose ones. Whether or not we want SSD, solid state disks, or traditional spinning disks, there's no reason to not choose the premium disks unless you have a specific operations per second requirement for the standard spinning disks. Okay, so I always usually choose B1MS for my development virtual machines. It's only $20 a month, and so this can remain running and not be too expensive. You'll see the DS1 that Microsoft is pushing me towards is 6 times more expensive, $120 per month. Now this virtual machine is not going to live for more than a few hours, so I don't mind selecting the default, but these are some of the considerations you have for choosing a virtual machine. Next up, you have to create an administrator account on that virtual machine. This is going to be the username and password that you're going to use to log in to Windows. So be sure and choose a secure username and password. Now, the only way you can log into Windows is using a remote desktop, Windows Remote Desktop. And in order to do that, you're going to have to open up the port. Unless you're running on a VPN or an express route, you're going to have to open up a port to allow your computer running on the open internet to connect to your machine using RDP. So in this screen, I choose RDP as an open port. I could also choose HTTP, HTTPS if I wanted to run a web server, or SSH if I was running a Linux machine, but I'm not going to do that. Now there's a second opportunity to choose ports later on in the wizard, but this is your first chance. Some of you might know that you can actually save a lot of money by choosing the Windows Azure Hybrid benefit. So if you already have a license for Windows in your company that you're willing to allocate to this, so let's say as an enterprise agreement, you can run 100 Windows Server 2016s and you're not even close to that, you could obviously say, I do have a Windows license, and you would basically, I believe it's about 49%, 50% for saving, for using an existing Windows license called Azure Hybrid Benefit. Let's go on to the next screen. So I'll say next. Now we chose a premium disk, so there are premium SSD. There's also the option of standard SSD and regular spinning hard disk. We'll just leave it at premium for now. Now this is obviously going to impact your operating system disk. So the SSD option is a much faster option. It'll boot quicker, and operations basically go quicker when it comes to solid state versus a traditional spinning disk. Microsoft is now talking about this Ultra SSD option. It's not available for this VM size and location, but if you really need maximum speed for your operating system disk, be sure and choose an instance type and location that supports SSD, and you can opt into that. So there's even a higher speed, more premium plan than even premium. Now, if you need to add additional disks to your VM, then you can create, the D drive and the E drive and the F drive. You can basically create additional disks that become your data disks. Now, data disks have an advantage in that they can be detached and attached to a different VM. So if this VM, if you ever wanted to move the data from one VM to another, you create it as a data, put stuff into a data disk, and then that data disk becomes portable. Let's go on to the networking. Now, by default, it's going to create me a brand new virtual network. Now, we're not going to get too much into what virtual networks are, but a virtual network is representation of a network. It's going to provide you an IP address. It's going to implement a very basic limit type of security. So this concept of the network security group is going to basically allow you to filter out. Remember, we wanted to open up only one of the ports, the RDP port. Well, this is going to be basically enforced by the network security group, and that network security group is attached to the network interface card, which is attached to the network. So all virtual machines, and there's some other types of resources that get connected to a virtual network. This is essentially the infrastructure part of infrastructure as a service. Now, if you're creating multiple VMs and you want them to talk to each other, it makes some sense to put them not only on the same VNet, but also on the same subnet. That way, machines can talk to each other without going through any type of security. If you're going to create new virtual networks or new subnets for other virtual machines and you need them to talk to each other, you're going to have to set up a VNet peering situation, which is an additional level of security that will allow traffic to travel between two different networks. All right. Accelerated networking. If you've got, again, multiple virtual machines that need to connect with each other on the same network, you might want to look into accelerated networking, because this actually simplifies the process of two machines talking to each other. There's less hops, it goes over less nodes, etc. This VM size, DS1 V2, or if I recall, doesn't support accelerated networking. We could basically automatically add this VM to a backend pool, which is part of an existing load balancing. I don't have a load balancer set up, but if this was the third, the fourth, or the fifth VM, we can sort of shortcut some effort by adding it to the pool. Going on to the next screen, do we want diagnostics, right? So we can have boot diagnostics, turn that off, operating system diagnostics. We can basically run this as a managed identity. Right now we set a user ID and password, but we could obviously allow Microsoft Azure to create a system level account, and this will basically a managed identity. Auto shutdown. I always like to set up auto shutdown because sometimes you forget. You created a VM like this, it's going to run up about $1 a day of expenses. And oh, this is the 120. So this is about $4 a day in expenses. So if you forget about it, I want this machine to shut itself down in a couple hours, which is 7 p.m. my time. That way you save money. So when the machine's not running, you're not charged for the compute element of that. You might be still charged for the storage, but you won't be charged for the compute. So turning off an auto shutdown for a development machine makes sense. I won't enable any backups at this point. Now we don't need any extensions. If we were doing backups or enhanced diagnostics and things like that, you would have to install extensions, but we're not going to do any of that, scripts and agents and things like that. Now tagging. Now perhaps we want this resource. I mean, it's pretty much a common practice, I guess, to use tagging for billing, for making sure that if you've got an account with hundreds of resources, you need some sort of metadata attached to those resources so that you can go back to the project leader, go back to the person. Maybe there's an email address that goes in here. Basically, you can set up a tag that stays with the resource, and then it allows you to go back after and to figure out, can I delete this? Who's responsible for this, etc. Any kind of metadata that you want, the billing code. That is it for the 5 tabs here. Now, if we go to the review screen, we can see here DS1 V2. It is 16 cents per hour Canadian, and so that's sort of laying out the cost that I'm signing up for here. There's some terms here, so if I say create, I'm sort of agreeing. We can see a summary of all the decisions that I've made up to this point, except for the admin password's not in here. Now, a really cool thing that you can do is you can download the template for automation. So the ARM templates live in this download button. And so after you've used all the wizard to create it, if you don't necessarily want to create it right now, but you want to automate the creation, then having this template is pretty cool. You can edit the template, check it into your source control, or use that on your side to use the programmatic APIs in order to create these machines over and over and over, right? So this is a way of almost customizing an image just for you so that you have the same settings every time. It's also used for something called desired state configuration, DSC, which allows you to ensure that your virtual machines never change. So you basically use a template to define the virtual machine, and then even if someone manually changes a setting, then the template will make sure that it's kept to the original. So I'm going to click the create button, and we'll just let Microsoft go off and create this virtual machine. Based on my recent experience today, yesterday, it's been taking about 4 minutes for this. I do like this status screen that comes up now. So as we hit the create button, it says your deployment is underway, and we can actually watch it. It's actually the time is actually ticking here. We can actually watch it as it creates resources. Got me an IP address and a virtual network already, and so we can sort of see the resources being created. And I'm going to pause the video. When we come back, we will see our virtual machine, hopefully, up and running. So there we go. It took me just over 4 minutes and 5 seconds to create all these resources. Now I could go directly to the virtual machine by clicking go to resource. And we can see here I have a virtual machine that's running a Windows standard DS1 V2 as we expected. It has an IP address that's available to the public. But before I do that, I'm going to go to the resource group. So I'm going to click on resource group, and I can see that 6 resources with a virtual machine and 5 others were created in this group. So we have the operating system disk, a network interface card, a virtual network interface card. The public IP address is itself a resource. Network security group, which is allows the traffic to travel from the internet to this resource only for the port, RDP port, and the network that the resource runs on. So if I ever wanted to undo what I just did, delete all these resources, there's a delete resource group button here, and that will just clean everything up. That's why I put this in its own resource group. So let's go into the virtual machine, And we can see that it is up and running. And Microsoft gives us some graphs here to show that the CPU was under some pressure, but then it's back down to low number now, 20%. Now, how do I connect to this? If I wanted to prove this was running and it's a machine that I can use, there's a connect menu item. And when I click it, I have the option of, for Windows Virtual Machine, the RDP connection, or for a Linux machine, the SSH connection. I can download this RDP file. I'll do that. And that will just basically allow me to connect to this machine. I mean, I can do it by knowing the IP address. I can just use RDP, but this is the configuration file for that. So I'm going to click that. And the first question is, do I trust this computer? And yes, I do. I just created it. I trust it. Now remember, we created a user ID and password for administrators. And so this is where you enter your user ID and password using another account. You can't use your home computer's account or whatever. So I'm going to say OK. Now it's asking me again if I trust it because the security certificate is not publicly signed. And so I'm going to say yes, the certificate. We can ignore the certificate issue. Now, the first time I'm connecting to this machine, it needs to build a profile. It's a standard Windows building user profile. This machine's pretty decently powered, so it should be pretty quick. But we're going to see what this machine looks like when it starts for the first time. Okay. So this is a Windows Server 2016 Data Center Edition. I can go through the process of setting it up now. It looks, acts, seems like a computer that's just been freshly installed with Windows. And go to the Windows Start menu here. And we can sort of see the usual empty, there's nothing installed. Server Manager starts by default on Windows servers, and then that allows me to install roles. If I want to turn this into a web server or some other type of server, I can go through this process. So in this video, we successfully created a Windows Virtual Machine on Microsoft Azure. We can see that it's successfully up and running, and I can now use this machine for whatever purpose I want. It's going to cost me 16 cents per hour at this level. And so when I'm done with it, being done with it is fairly straightforward. Obviously, you want to disconnect from it, but as I showed you before, you're going to want to stop the virtual machine in order to stop the charges. And eventually, you're going to want to not only delete the virtual machine, but you're going to want to delete all of the resources in the resource group as well, because the storage account has a fee for storing the virtual hard disk as well. Most of these things, like the virtual network and the network interface, don't have a fee. Public IP address has a fee as well. So some of these things will cost you money, and so when you're done with it, come up here and delete the resource group. Thanks so much for watching this video. If this was useful to you, I have a number of Azure certification training courses. Go check me out. The link is in the description of the video. And hit subscribe, hit like. I appreciate this. If you want to share this with your social networks, that would be awesome. Thank you so much. This has been Scott Duffy. We've created a Windows Virtual Machine together. You're awesome, and have a great day.